In 1879, just a few months before his death, Isaac Butt visited the home of his dear friend, the newspaper proprietor A.M. O'Sullivan. And at the end of the friendly chat, Butt got up to leave. And O'Sullivan turned to his son and he said, "Oh, don't forget to shake hands with Mr. Butt." And the son replied, "I will not shake hands with any damned Englishman." And Butt was horrified, and the father tried to apologise. But Butt, thinking that this just showed how far he had fallen in the family's favour, said, "So, that's the way the wind blows here now." And he walked out, never to return. I think what the story illustrates is just how Butt's reputation had fallen in that period. He had been the great champion of the Home Rule movement in the early 1870s, but events had overtaken him. And now Parnell and others had shown that there needed to be a more radical form of Irish nationalism. And Butt, who deserves an awful lot of credit for bringing this movement to the centre, had now been discarded. Parnell, at the start of 1880, was asked, "How come you haven't married? How come you're still a single man?" And Parnell just replied, "I am married. I am married to my country, and I serve her as best I can." The truth is, he was already involved in a relationship with Catherine O'Shea, a married woman, although separated, from Captain Willie O'Shea. And that relationship was really to be the great secret of British politics for the next decade. An open secret for those involved in politics, but a secret that would ultimately destroy him. Around this time, the Irish also gave the world a new word, the word boycotting. Because this was the period of the Land War, when as part of the new departure, they decided to challenge the government. They decided to say, well, we want fair rights for our tenants. We want them to have security on the land, so they can't just be evicted by a landlord because they've fallen behind on 1 month's rent. We want them to have the same rights that the tenants in Ulster have, because it's not fair that those in the south don't have those rights. They wanted the rents to be fair. And they decided, well, if it's not a fair rent, we're not going to pay it at all. We're going to pay it to the Land League, and they will negotiate with the landlords and agree a fair rent. So in other words, you will either get a fair rent or you'll get nothing at all. And this was challenged by the landlords, who began evicting tenants all across the country. And so things began to escalate. And there was violence. And Parnell came out with a new strategy to boycott the people. And it got its name from the first person it was used on. A landlord, an agent for a landlord called Captain Boycott. And he was ignored. He was snubbed. He was ostracised. It was a new strategy outlined by Parnell, where he said that this is what you should do to the landlords. This is what you should do to their agents. This is what you should do if another tenant takes the land of someone who has been evicted. You should shun them. You should ignore them. He said, when a man takes a farm from another who has been evicted, you must show him on the roadside when you meet him. You must show him in the streets of the town. You must show him at the shop counter. You must show him in the fair and in the marketplace, and even in the house of worship, by leaving him severely alone, by putting him into a sort of moral coventry, by isolating him from the rest of his kind, as if he were a leper of old. And so the word boycott entered the lexicon, and it proved to be a very valuable weapon against these landlords, against these agents, and against these unscrupulous tenants. Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, though, was furious at Parnell for being involved in what he saw as an unparliamentary, illegal activity, and he arranged for Parnell to be arrested. And he was put on trial for conspiring to prevent the payment of rents and for trying to stop tenants from being evicted and trying to disrupt that whole process. And he was put on trial, but the jury couldn't come to an agreement, and the charges were dropped and he was released, his reputation enhanced. And to deal with all of these challenges, Gladstone realised he would have to do something. So he brought in a Land Act in 1881 to give the Irish tenants rights, to give them, to pass legislation that would protect them, to ease their concerns, to stop this vicious land war. But Parnell didn't embrace this Land Act. He said, well, we have to test it. We have to make sure that it actually is going to be doing what the promises say that it will do. I don't believe Gladstone. I don't trust him. I don't like him. And so they decided to test the Act. And because the land war continued and some of the land leaguers issued a no-rent manifesto calling on the tenants to continue not to pay their rents, the government swooped again and arrested Parnell. And he was sent to Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, where he remained the next few months. And writing to Catherine O'Shea, he said, I'm actually glad I'm arrested. This has actually worked out very well for me because the movement is breaking all around me. It won't last very, very much longer. And I'm safe here in prison. I can remain out of all of this. And when the movement breaks, I can return to Parliament and we can carry on with our struggle for home rule. He had recognised the political reality and what was going to happen next. And he predicted that if he was in prison, well, he said, in a threat to the British government, he said, Captain Moonlight will take my place. And that was the name given to the agrarian radicals, the men who would strike in the middle of the night to kill disgraceful landlords, to kill, to murder. And that is exactly what happened. Lawlessness increased. A Coercion Act was passed, and it looked like Ireland was on the brink of open war, open rebellion. And Gladstone was forced to negotiate a deal. They needed to get Parnell out of prison. They couldn't have him there. They needed him back in Parliament to calm things down. And so a deal was negotiated, what became known as the Kilmainham Treaty. And in return, the unpopular Chief Secretary, William Forster, agreed to resign. He would step down. The Coercion Act would be allowed lapse. In return, Parnell would be released and things would calm down. And the person who negotiated this, who acted on Parnell's behalf, was Catherine O'Shea's husband, Willie O'Shea. And Sir William Harcourt, a diplomat who was involved in these negotiations, gave a report to the British cabinet where he said, the Kilmainham Treaty would not be popular if the public ever discovered that it had been negotiated by Captain O'Shea, the husband of Parnell's mistress. So, Parnell was released. The relationship with Catherine O'Shea was not exposed, and things looked like they would go back to normal. Forster resigned as Chief Secretary, and Gladstone decided to send someone new. He decided to send a man called Lord Frederick Cavendish to Ireland as Chief Secretary, and he knew and he liked Cavendish. He was married to Gladstone's niece. And this was to usher in a new era of peace and reconciliation in Ireland. However, within a few days of landing in Ireland, Cavendish and his Undersecretary, a man called Burke, were murdered while they were strolling in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. They were murdered by a group called the Invincibles, a radical offshoot of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they decided to strike at the heart of British rule in Ireland and murder these two men. And the Phoenix Park murders, the murders of the Invincibles, sent shockwaves through the British political system. These were the worst political assassinations since the murder of Spencer Perceval, the Prime Minister, in 1812. And they shocked Parnell to the core. He wrote to Gladstone immediately, offering to resign as leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And Gladstone refused. He said, no, I need you there. I need you as leader. I don't accept the resignation. Don't resign. Please don't resign. And Parnell stayed on. But he issued a public address to the Irish people denouncing the murders. And he followed it up in the British House of Commons, where he denounced this savage, brutal striking down of two men who had just arrived in Ireland, who were just out for a walk in public. And the murder of the Invincibles in the short term calmed things down, because that really kind of marked the end of the violent agitation. that revulsion afterwards ensured that things calmed down. People began to accept the Land Act of 1881. It turned out the principles were helping the Irish tenants, and so the land movement was no longer a significant force in Irish politics. And you also see the ruthlessness there of Parnell as a politician. There's a story, and it's possibly apocryphal, but I think there's a truth to it. And I think that is the kind of thing that we know certainly when David and Parnell met, they had conversations like this. On one occasion, David asked Parnell, you know, it's possible that if we win Home Rule, you'll become a Prime Minister. You'll be Prime Minister of Ireland. What's the first thing you do? And Parnell is alleged to have replied, the first thing I would do is I would lock you up. Now, it might never happen. If it did happen, it probably was said as a joke. It was probably the two men having a laugh saying, well, I'd get rid of you. But I think there was a truth behind the joke. And that was that all of these things were an example of Parnell as the master politician, the master strategist, the way he was able to appear all things to all men and make it look like he was more radical than he actually was, that he was perhaps more of a Fenian than he actually was. And he wasn't a Fenian at all. But he was able to talk their language. He was able to give violent, aggressive speeches. He was able to meet with the Fenian leaders and discuss whether a future rebellion might succeed. And he'd say things like, I think the landscape of Ireland doesn't make it a very good country for rebellions. And they thought, oh, that's very interesting. That shows that he has a good strategic mind. So this was Parnell, the politician, in action. Parnell, though, was having his own problems in this period. He didn't have very much money. The rents from his own lands weren't very high, and he couldn't give a bad example by evicting anyone. And so he was short of money. And when that was discovered, a national subscription was raised in 1883. And the church was against it. The Vatican denounced it. But yet the people gave their money, just as they had for O'Connell in the past. And £30,000 was raised. And a big event was organised in Dublin where they would present this cheque to Parnell and decided to make it a big event with lots of speeches. And you see then the Lord Mayor was at the stand and he had a big speech prepared and he was going to go over Parnell's career and honour him. But Parnell was a very proud man. He didn't like this. He didn't like his financial affairs being made public and being embarrassed by having a huge crowd to see this. And as soon as the Lord Mayor began his speech, Parnell just stood up and he said, I believe you have something for me, and stretched out his hand. And the Lord Mayor stopped and took out the cheque and gave it to Parnell. And Parnell said, thank you, and walked off. And some people use that as an example of Parnell's pride, his arrogance, that he saw himself as maybe a little bit better than everyone else. In 1885, Gladstone's government was brought down, and brought down in part because Parnell and the Irish MPs voted against them. They didn't really like the Conservatives, the other party. They knew the Conservatives would probably be less supportive of Home Rule, but this was a way of exerting your influence. If the Liberals won't support us on Home Rule, we'll knock them out of power. And a general election was called, and Parnell called on the Irish supporters in England not to vote for the Liberals. And as a result, the Liberals did not get an overall majority. Let's look at the figures for that election. The Liberals got 335 seats. The Conservatives got 249. And Parnell and his party got 86. And just do the maths on that. Do the calculation. And what you see is that if you add the Conservative vote to the Irish vote, it's exactly 335, which means the Liberals did not have a majority. And so they could not govern without Irish support. And Parnell was then able to negotiate with them. And by negotiate, he was able to give them a threat. You must now support Home Rule or else we will make sure that you will never be able to govern. And Gladstone suddenly, miraculously, had a conversion to Home Rule. And in 1886, the first Home Rule bill was brought before the British House of Commons.